The screaming started at 0600 station time and nobody moved. That was the thing that hit hardest later when people looked back at that morning on Nexus-7 Station. Not the creature itself, not the blood, not even the sound, but the fact that hundreds of beings stood in that wide-open plaza, and not one of them took a single step forward. The Vorkai had come off a cargo vessel from Kethra, a Deathworld so hostile that even its plants had teeth. The creature was six-limbed, the size of a ground transport, and covered in overlapping dark scales that caught the station light like whetstone. Its four rear limbs dragged against the floor plates, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Its two front limbs swung in wide, desperate arcs, knocking over supply crates and sending smaller aliens scrambling in every direction. It was not attacking anyone. Who had ever worked with animals would have seen that immediately, but no one in that plaza had. The Vorkai was crying. The sound it made was not like anything most of the beings present had ever heard. It was low and constant, and it went right through the chest like a vibration more than a sound. Its jaw hung slightly open, acidic saliva dripping in long pale strings onto the floor plates, where it hissed faintly against the metal. Its eyes, six of them arranged in two rows, were half closed and glassy with pain. The station medical team had arrived fast. That much they did right. Four Shalian nurses in full hazard suits stood at the edge of the plaza behind a temporary barrier. They had scanners, they had equipment, they had a full emergency cart. They were not moving. Behind them stood Commander Velton of the Galactic Medical Corps, a tall Veshan with pale gray skin and the kind of perfectly straight posture that came from years of issuing orders he expected to be followed. He was speaking into a comm unit, his voice tight and controlled. Station security had their weapons raised. The crowd that had gathered at the outer edges of the plaza was enormous, every species imaginable pressed together behind rope barriers. Chelians, Mirathi, Dreka, a group of wide-eyed Yorn diplomats still holding their welcome packets from whatever conference had brought them. Here, all of them watching, all of them still. A young Felian medical student named Pip stood near the front of the medical team. He was shaking slightly, not from cold. His scanner was in his hands, but he had stopped looking at it. He was just watching the Vorkai drag itself in a slow circle, its breathing coming in heavy, wet pulls, and thinking in a distant, horrified way that he had no idea what to do, and neither did anyone else. Commander Velton lowered his comm unit. The order he was about to give was not a medical one. Then someone pushed past Pip from behind, not roughly, not with any urgency in the way you would expect, not running, not shouting, just a steady, firm movement through the crowd, the way someone moves when they have already made a decision and the deciding is done. Pip turned. She was human. He knew that much because he had done a xenobiology rotation, and humans were in the curriculum, though mostly as a footnote in the section about statistically improbable species survival. He remembered the notes bipedal mammalian from a Class 4 Deathworld called Earth. Remarkable immune systems and a deeply puzzling relationship with danger. She looked ordinary. That was the strangest part. She was not tall, she was not armored. She had dark skin and short natural hair, and she was wearing a plain gray field jacket with a patch on the shoulder that said something in a human script Pip could not read. She had a worn bag over one shoulder, and she was looking at the Vorkai with an expression he could not immediately name, not fernet bravado, something more like focus, the way a person looks when they are solving a problem. She was already moving toward the barrier. Pip heard himself say something like wait or stop or you cannot go in there, but the words came out wrong and small, and she did not slow down. She ducked under the barrier tape in one smooth motion and straightened up on the other side. Commander Velton turned sharply. She was already 10 steps into the plaza. She had not pulled a weapon. She had not turned on any kind of scanner or protective field. She had just walked in, and then the thing that nobody who saw it in person ever fully managed to explain afterward happened. She stopped walking. She crouched down. She made herself small. Her hands went out to her sides, open palmed fingers loose, not reaching, not pointing, just open. She lowered her chin. She looked at the ground just slightly to the side of the Vorkai, not at it, not direct, not challenging, just present. And she began to talk, not loudly, not in any language the creature could possibly understand. Just a low, steady stream of words in plain human English, the tone flat and calm and unbroken like running water. The Vorkai stopped moving, not All at once it slowed, first one limb at a time. The frantic, dragging, circular movement wound down the jaw, came up slightly. The 6 eyes turned toward her. Every person behind the barriers stopped breathing. The Vorkai was looking at her. She did not move back. She did not raise her hands. She did not change her voice. She just stayed there, crouched and open, and kept talking, and after a long, terrible moment that seemed to stretch far past its natural length, the creature made a sound, low, quiet. A different sound than the one before. Pip realized his scanner was reading something. He looked down at it without meaning to vital signs. The Vorkai's heart rate had dropped 11 points in 40 seconds. He looked back up. She was closer now. She had moved without any of them seeing her move. Commander Velton had not given the security team the order. He was standing with his cum unit at his side, and he was watching the human woman cross a plaza that his best medics had declared a fatal zone, and he was not moving either, not because he was afraid, because something old and quiet in the back of his mind was telling him that whatever was happening in front of him right now was the kind of thing you did not interrupt. Pip took one step forward without deciding to. The human woman was close enough now to touch the Vorkash. Reached out one hand very slowly. The creature could have killed her in less than a second. Everyone knew that. Everyone standing there did the math automatically. Claws reflexive, even in sleep. Acidic output at close range, enough mass to crush a being her size without effort. The Vorkai pressed its head against her open palm. Pip heard someone behind him make a sound like a quiet, broken exhale. The human woman kept talking. She had not stopped once. Pip looked at her jacket patch again, and this time in the silence and the stillness he was close enough to read it. It said, Dr. Sera Okafor, Veterinary Medicine, Earth Colonial Division. He did not know what a veterinarian was. He looked it up on his cum unit right there in the middle of everything because his brain needed something to do with itself. He read the definition. He read it again. He looked up at the woman with her hand pressed gently against the face of an apex predator from a Deathworld, while every trained medical professional on the station stood behind a barrier tape, and he felt something move through him that was not quite awe and not quite shame, but lived somewhere between. The two. Sera Okafor did not look back at any of them. She was already working. The wound was under the third limb joint on the left side, and it was bad. Sera did not need a scanner to tell her that she could smell infection. She had been able to smell infection since her second year of training, when her professor at the Earth Colonial Veterinary Institute had told her that machines could measure, but noses could know. She had thought it was an old person saying something poetic until the third time a scanner had missed a deep tissue infection that her nose had caught. First, she pressed gently along the Vorkai's side with her fingertips moving in slow circles, the way she would with any large animal, feeling for heat, feeling for flinching, feeling for the spots that made the creature hold its breath. The Vorkai held very still. That was the other thing people watching from behind the barrier did not understand. They saw a giant predator going quiet, and they thought she had done something extraordinary, something almost magical, but Sera knew what had actually happened. She had simply spoken the oldest language there was, the language of something hurting and something else coming close without threat. Every animal understood that language. Every animal that had ever been in pain and had another creature approach it softly and slowly and without aggression had understood in whatever way animals understood anything, that help was possible. That was not magic. That was biology. That was 100 million years of creatures learning each other. Pip had crossed the barrier. He had not meant to do it the same way people do not mean to lean forward during a tense moment in a story. His feet had simply decided, and then he was on the other side of the tape with his scanner in his hands, and Sera had glanced at him once and said quietly, "Readings, please." And that had been enough. He was helping now. There was no going back. His scanner swept the Vorkai's side, and the numbers that came up made his throat tighten. The infection had been building for at least 6 days. The puncture wound was deep, almost certainly from a cargo hook or a sheared loading plate edge. The tissue around it had turned, and the bacterial spread had reached the secondary nerve cluster under the limb joint. That was why the creature could not walk right. That was why it had been dragging that side. That was why the pain had built past the point of hiding it the way predators always tried to do, because predators hid pain. That was the first thing. Pip said the numbers out loud. Quietly, Sera nodded. She had already known most of it. She was looking around the plaza, assessing what was available, the way someone does when they are used to working in places that are not equipped for what they need to do. Field conditions: a ranch at midnight, a wildlife reserve during flood season, a cargo hold on a generation ship somewhere between stars. Commander Velton had crossed the barrier too. He had not planned to do that either. He was standing 6 feet back, hands clasped behind him, watching with an expression that had started as outrage and was now something altogether different. He had served in the Galactic Medical Corps for 22 years. He had a wall of credentials. He had overseen emergency responses on 14 stations. He had never in his career crossed a hazard barrier toward an unrestrained Class 7 biological threat. He was aware of that fact. He chose not to examine it closely. Sera spoke without turning around. I need a thermal compress pack, the large Terran livestock size, if they have it in the medical bay. If not, bring me 2 standard packs and medical adhesive and whatever topical antiseptic they stock for. Catherine Fauna, if they do not have that, bring me the broadest spectrum liquid antiseptic in the bay, and I will make it work. Also, irrigation tube and a drain kit and something I can use for packing. Sterile fiber or clean cloth, either works. Velton looked at his nurses behind the barrier. The nurses looked at each other. Velton said quietly, "Get her what she asked for." One of the nurses turned and Rampip was still watching his scanner. He said, "Her vitals are still dropping. She is calmer." Sera said, "I know," without looking up from the wound. She was parting the scales around it carefully, the way you part fur. Each scale lifted gently and held aside so she could see beneath it was delicate work. The Vorkai made a low sound once when she hit a sensitive point, and she stopped immediately and waited and talked, and when the creature settled, she continued. Pip asked, "How are you not afraid?" He had not planned to ask it. It came out of him the way questions do when something has dismantled every assumption you built your understanding of the world. Sera was quiet for a moment. She was irrigating the wound now, working with steady hands, the movement practiced and efficient. Then she said, "I grew up on Earth, which means I grew up on a planet where the grass could hide something that kills you in 4 minutes, and the ocean is mostly things that would like to eat you, and even the domestic animals we keep as companions have enough strength to break a person in half if they decide to." She paused to check the depth of the wound. She said, "You learn a thing on a planet like that. You learn that fear is just information. It tells you to pay attention. It does not tell you to stop. You feel it, you note it, and then you move anyway, because the animal in front of you is also afraid, and if both of you freeze, nothing gets better." Pip absorbed this. Velton said nothing, but his posture had changed slightly. The rigid authority of it had softened at the edges in a way he was not fully aware of. The supplies arrived. Sera assessed them, quickly discarded 2 items, kept the rest, and began laying them out in a specific order that made no sense to Pip until she started using them, and then suddenly it made complete sense. She was working like someone who had done this in worse conditions, with less equipment, in the dark, in the rain, with no one watching and no one coming to help. Compress went on first, positioned not over the wound but around it, drawing heat away from the inflamed tissue gently enough that the Vorkai would not startle. She secured it with the adhesive in long, careful strips, pressing each one down slowly. The creature let her. Pip realized he had been holding his breath for approximately 4 minutes. Velton said quietly from behind them both, "The regulations for a Class 7 unrestrained biological," and then he stopped. Sera said, "The regulations were written by people who never touched one." She said it without heat, without accusation, the way you state something that is simply true. Velton did not respond. The wound was open now, cleaned and draining. Sera packed it with clean fiber, and her hands did not shake once. She worked in silence for a while, and the Vorkai's breathing slowed further, and the 6 eyes grew heavy. Not from sedation, but from the first real relief from pain it had felt in nearly a week. Pip looked at the creature's face. He thought, "It looks tired, dangerous, not alien, not terrifying, just tired, the way any creature looks when it has been hurting. Alone for a long time, and someone has finally come close enough to help." Sera said, "Hand me the secondary antiseptic," and Pip handed it over, and they worked together in the quiet of the plaza while the entire station watched through its windows and barriers and live feeds, and Velton stood behind them both with his credentials and his regulations and his 22 years of service, and said nothing at all. The Vorkai made a sound low and deep and subsonic. Every alien on every observation Deck flinched back from the glass. Pip flinched to Sera. Did not she had already recognized it? She had heard that sound before in different throats from different creatures. Horses, cattle, great cats, wolves on 3 different continents and once. From a Terran elephant in a sanctuary outside Nairobi on a warm evening when the light was gold and she had spent 6 hours removing an infected tux fragment, and when it was finally done the elephant had leaned against her and made a sound very much like the one the Vorkai was making now, not a threat to release the body, finally putting down the weight of pain it had been carrying alone. Sera put her hand flat against the creature's side. She said very quietly to no one in particular, "We are through the hard part?" Nobody left. That was the thing that surprised Velton most when he looked back later at everything that happened that morning on Nexus-7. In his experience, crowds dispersed once a crisis stopped being immediate, once the screaming stopped, once the immediate danger passed. People moved on. They had places to be, schedules to keep the ordinary forward motion of life, pulling them away from whatever spectacle had briefly held them. Nobody left. The observation windows were still full. Every corridor that had a sight line to the plaza was packed 3 levels above the floor plate. A group of Yorn diplomats had pulled chairs to the glass and were sitting in a row watching in complete silence, like people watching something they did not have words for. Yet down in the plaza, Sera was still working. The hard part being done did not mean the work was done. The infection had to be managed. The drainage had to be maintained. The tissue around the wound needed support, and the compress needed adjustment every few minutes as the heat shifted, and through all of it, the Vorkai needed to stay calm, which meant Sera needed to stay present and keep the low, steady voice going and keep her movements slow and deliberate and keep existing in the space next to a creature that could end her in a moment, as though that fact were simply not the most important thing in the room. Pip had stopped shaking. He was not sure exactly when that had happened. He was monitoring readings now with something that felt almost like competence, tracking the Vorkai's heart rate and core temperature and the bacterial markers in the blood work that the scanner could pull from surface capillary reads. He reported numbers to Sera every few minutes, and she listened and adjusted and told him what to watch next. It felt like working, real working, not the careful performance of procedure he had been trained to carry out in clean, controlled environments with proper equipment and proper classification and proper authorization, and the full chain of regulation standing behind every decision like a row of locked doors. This felt like the thing that existed before all of that. The older thing, he asked, because the silence between data readings was long enough that his brain went wandering and went somewhere it could not get back from easily. He asked how humans had learned to do this, not confrontationally, not the way Velton might ask it, with the slight edge of a person whose professional framework is being quietly challenged. He asked it the way a student asks a question when the answer might be the most important thing they hear. That Sera was checking the drain. She spoke without pausing her hands. She said, "We started with dogs." Pip waited. She said, "Tens of thousands of years ago on Earth, humans and wolves found each other, 2 predator species." She paused and smiled slightly at the wound she was tending. Well, one full predator species and one species that thought it was a predator but was honestly more of an anxious omnivore with good endurance. They found each other, and instead of one destroying the other, they made an agreement. Nobody signed it. Nobody spoke it. It was just behavior over time. Wolves that came close instead of running got fed. Humans that came close instead of fleeing got protected. Back and forth across hundreds of generations until what had been evolved was something new, something that wanted to be near us, something that brought us its pain instead of hiding it. She secured the compress edge and sat back slightly, her hands resting easy. She said, "And then we did it again with horses, which are prey animals, which is a completely different challenge because a prey animal's entire nervous system is built around running from you. So we learned a different skill. We learned stillness. We learned that you do not reach for a frightened horse. You exist near it. You let it decide. You make yourself the least threatening thing in its world until it chooses to come to you." And they did. They always eventually did, Pip said. And then Sera said, "And then we did it with everything else. Cattle, pigs, working birds, great cats and sanctuaries, bears and rehabilitation elephants, marine animals, reptiles. 10,000 years of practice on 10,000 different nervous systems until the knowledge was not just in books, it was in hands, it was in how we walked, how we breathed, how we positioned our bodies in a room with something. Frightened and in pain, we learned it the way you learn anything that matters, by doing it wrong first and paying the price and doing it again. Velton had moved closer. He was not aware of doing it. He was simply closer than he had been, and his scanner was in his hands now, pointed at the Vorkai, though the readings it gave him were secondary to what he was actually doing, which was listening. Pip asked, "Did you always love them, the dangerous ones?" Sera was quiet long enough that Pip thought he had asked something too personal. Then she said, "I think we love them because they are dangerous, not in spite of it. There is something in the human brain that reaches toward the thing that could hurt it. When we survive that reach, when the creature lets us close, when the trust happens, there is nothing else like that feeling in the world. There is not a medal or a certification or a commendation that touches it." She looked at the Vorkai's face. The 6 eyes were half closed. The breathing was slow, and even she said, "This one has been in pain for 6 days alone." Probably did not show it for the first 4, because that is what predators do. They hide it until they cannot. Because in the wild, the moment you show pain, something else sees it and decides you are worth the risk. It has been carrying that alone for 6 days, and now it is not, and it knows that I did that. And I know that it knows. Pip looked at the creature. He looked at it differently than he had before. He was a medical student. He had done his xenobiology, his comparative anatomy, his toxicology certification, his hazard response training. He had read about Vorkai extensively. They were in the textbook under the heading Fauna Requiring Maximum Caution. And the profile was full of words like lethal and reflexive and unpredictable, and non-communicative textbook had not mentioned that they could look grateful, but that was what he was looking at. The creature was looking at Sera with those 6 half-closed eyes, and there was something in the way it held itself. The absence of tension, the weight of it settled rather than coiled. That was not a physiological reading. He could not put it on a scanner. It was just visible. Levelton said from behind them both, his voice lower than usual, "How many species can you treat?" Sera did not look up. She said, "Anything with a nervous system and a circulatory system gives me a working foundation. The specifics change, the principles do. Not pain is pain, fear is fear, trust is trust. Those things are not species specific, they are life specific." Velton said, "And if you had not been on this station today," Sera said, "somebody else would have figured it out eventually." Velton said, "No, they would not have." He paused, and the honesty in it was slightly painful, the way it is when someone in authority admits something about the limits of their authority. "I have 17 medics on this station, Dr. Okafor, 17 trained, certified licensed medical professionals with combined experience across 46 species. And every one of them stood behind that barrier, and not one of them had any framework for what you walked into this plaza and did without hesitation. I would like to understand why that is." Sera finally looked up at him. She said, "Because your medicine is built around species that ask for help. Mine is built around species that could not ask, so we learned to read instead." The station was very quiet around them. 3 levels up the row of Yorn diplomats were still sitting at the glass. One of them had pressed a hand flat against the window. Nobody was going anywhere. The Vorkai slept, not the shallow, restless unconsciousness of a sedated animal, but real sleep. The kind of sleep that comes after a long sustained pain finally breaks, the way a fever breaks and the body floods with relief, and everything that had been held tight in anticipation of the next wave of hurt finally releases and goes soft, and the breathing slows and deepens, and the weight of the creature settles into the floor like something that has been carrying itself upright for too long and has finally been allowed to stop. Sera sat on the floor next to it. She was exhausted in the way that had nothing to do with physical effort, though there had been plenty of that, and everything to do with the particular sustained cost of holding yourself completely steady in a situation that is trying very hard to make you not steady. She had been doing that for nearly 3 hours, and now that it was done, the weariness came in all at once, the way it always did. She leaned her back against the Vorkai's warm flank, which rose and fell slowly beneath her, and she accepted the water pouch that Pip held out to her, and she drank half of it without stopping. Pip sat down too, not next to the Vorkai. He was not quite there yet, but close. He sat on the floor of the plaza with his scanner in his lap and his hazard certification badge still clipped to his coat, and his entire understanding of xenobiology and emergency medicine quietly rearranging itself into a new shape that he suspected would not fully finish settling for months. He said, "It is on the galactic net." Sera looked at him. He showed her his cum screen. The footage was everywhere. Someone had captured the whole thing from the upper observation deck. Sera ducking under the barrier taped, Sera crouching in the open plaza, the Vorkai going still the moment her hand made contact. The clip was 38 seconds long. It had been shared 400,000 times in the last 2 hours. The number was still climbing. The title on the most shared version read, "Human Woman Does What No Medical Team Would." Sera looked at it for a moment. She handed the cum unit back. She said, "Fantastic." She did not mean it positively. Pip understood and said nothing. Velton approached from the direction of the medical bay where he had spent the last hour on a series of cum calls that had become progressively more significant in terms of who was on the other end. He looked like a man who had begun the morning with a clear picture of how the world worked and was ending it in a somewhat different relationship with that picture. He crouched down, which for a Veshan of his height was a considerable physical commitment, and looked at the sleeping Vorkai and then at Sera and said, "The Corps wants a full incident report." Sera said, "I assume it." Velton said, "They are also asking questions. I do not have good answers to." He paused. "Specifically, they are asking why there is no xeno-veterinary protocol in the emergency response framework for transit stations, why there is no cross-species crisis classification for dangerous fauna in distress, why we have extensive documentation on how to contain and, if necessary, destroy fauna that poses a threat, and essentially nothing on how to help them." Sera said. "And what did you tell them?" Velton said. "I told them I would find out." He looked at his hands for a moment. He said, "A Drekka bloodhound was destroyed on Outpost 9 3 weeks ago. The animal was injured in a loading accident. It was aggressive from pain. Security could not safely contain it. There was no one who knew how to approach it." Sera looked at him. Velton said, "There have been others." He looked like the words cost him something. "I have been in this course for 22 years, Dr. Okafor. I have signed containment and termination orders for 14 animals in transit crisis situations in that time. I signed them because there was no other option in the framework I was working within. I am only now sitting in this plaza on the floor of Nexus-7. Considering the possibility that the framework was wrong." Sera did not offer him comfort. She did not tell him it was not his fault. She was quiet and let him sit with it because some things needed to be sat with. Then she said, "14." Velton nodded. She said, "Do you have the records?" He said. "I can get them." She said, "Get them then." The sound came from the far entrance of the plaza. It was a Kethran, the handler, the being who belonged to the Vorkai, or more accurately, the being the Vorkai belonged to, because the relationship between a Vorkai and its bonded handler was not one of ownership but of something older and more mutual. The handler was large by most species standards, though not by the Vorkais, and they were moving at the kind of speed that suggested they had been trying to get here for hours, delayed at customs, which was the kind of small bureaucratic cruelty that the universe seemed to specialize in on the worst possible days. The handler stopped at the edge of the plaza. They looked at the Vorkai sleeping on the floor. Sera watched the handler's face. She did not speak Kethran. She did not need to. Some things did not require translation. The handler crossed the plaza and went to their knees beside the creature, their bonded companion, their working partner, the being they had searched for across the station for 4 frantic hours after losing them in the freight bay chaos, and pressed their forehead against the Vorkai's neck and made a sound that was quiet and private and not meant for anyone. Elspeth looked away. Sera looked away. Even Velton looked away. There were kinds of grief and kinds of relief that deserved the dignity of not being observed. After a long moment, the handler straightened and turned to Sera. What they said took Pip a moment to process through his translation earpiece, and then he understood it and had to look at the floor again. The handler had said, "I would have been too late." Sera said, "You were not too late. That is the thing that counts." The handler looked at her for a long moment and then did something that Pip had never seen a Kethran do in any of his xenobiology coursework. He checked later, and it was not in the literature. Either the handler bowed, not a small incline of the head, the full deep formal bow of a Kethran, a gesture that in their culture was reserved for the saving of life, the kind of thing offered to beings of Tremendous honor. Sera looked genuinely uncomfortable, she said. I was just doing my job, the handler said. There is no just about it. They looked at the sleeping Vorkai and then back at Sera. Her name is Vika. She is 11 years old. She has been with me since she was 4 weeks. She has never let anyone touch her except me. She let you touch her. Sera looked at Vekash, said quietly. I know she had known from the moment it happened. She had known what it meant when a creature that trusted no one chose to trust. She had been trusted like that before. She had never once taken it lightly. She put her hand on. Vika sighed one more time, and the creature's breathing did not change, and that steadiness was its own kind of answervilton. Was watching all of this from a few feet away. He made a decision in that moment. He made several decisions. He would remember making them very clearly later. He would remember exactly what the plaza looked like, what the light was doing, what the Vorkai sounded like breathing, and where his hands were when the understanding finished arriving. He said, Dr. Okafor, when you are rested, I would like to speak with you about something formal. Sera looked up at him. He said, the Corps needs to build something. It does not currently have. I do not know yet exactly what shape it takes, but I believe you do. Sera was quiet for a moment. She looked at Vekash, said, I have a clinic on a colony world. I have patients waiting. Velton said, I know, and I am asking. Anyway, he waited. She did not say yes, but she did not say no, and Veka breathed slowly beneath her hand, and Pip was watching his scanner, and the galactic net number kept climbing, and somewhere 3 levels up, the Yorn diplomat finally lowered the hand that had been pressed against the glass and sat back in their chair and said something quietly to the diplomat beside them in a language Pip could not hear. Later, he learned what they had said. They had said, I did not know it was possible to be that gentle with something so dangerous. Neither had anyone else. She was going to leave. That had been the plan. She had booked her departure 2 days after the incident, and the plaza filled out the incident report for Velton answered the 17 follow-up questions from the Galactic Medical Corps' central office, packed her bag back the same way she had unpacked it, and told herself that what had happened in the plaza was a single moment. A good one, a necessary one, but a single moment, and that her life was on a colony world 3 transit jumps away, where there was a clinic and patients and a supply of work that never fully emptied. She was standing at the docking bay with her bag over her shoulder. When Pip found her, he looked like he had not slept. He probably had not. He had spent the 2 days since Vika's treatment doing something Sera had not asked him to do and had not expected. He had gone into the Galactic Medical Corps' incident records, all of them, 20 years of logged containment and termination events involving non-sapient fauna. In transit situations, he had read every file. He had a list. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it in his hand for a long moment, the way you look at something when you already know that picking it up is going to change the direction of things, and you are still deciding whether you are ready for that. Then she took it. The list was not long. It was not long at all. That was almost the worst part of it. It was 1 page, because the cases that made the records were only the ones that had reached crisis point, the ones where an animal had been injured in transit, or in a docking bay, or in a freight hold, and had become a danger or a disruption significant enough to log the ones that had been terminated or forcibly sedated with inappropriate compounds or left untreated until they died quietly in a cargo container somewhere. Between stars, the ones that never made the records were not there. She read the names and the species and the circumstances. A Drekka bloodhound with a shattered rear leg destroyed on Outpost 9, because it could not be approached, and no one knew how. A juvenile Yorn sea drake that had drowned in its own mucus in a sealed cargo container because the crew was afraid to open the container, and the medics on the nearest station had no classification for treating it. And by the time the paperwork for an exception was processed, the animal was dead. A bonded Mirathi hunting cat that had been shot by station security on hub Station Corral because it was crying, a loud, sustained distress cry that the security team had classified as aggressive behavior, and none of them had recognized it for what it was, which was grief, because its handler had died in a docking accident 2 hours before, and the cat had found the body and would not leave it, and when security tried to move it, it had fought back. The way any grieving creature fights back when someone tries to separate it from the last place it felt safe. Sera stopped reading at the hunting cat. She stood in the docking bay for a long time. Pip said, Those are the ones that made the records. There are 14 official cases in 20 years, but Velton thinks the real number is higher incidents that were handled locally without filing events that were classified differently to avoid the paperwork. He is trying to get the full count now. Sera said. How high? Pip said. He does not know yet. He thinks possibly 3 or 4 times the official number. She looked at the docking bay entrance. The ship she was supposed to be on was boarding. She thought about the colony clinic. She thought about the patients there, the work that waited, the supply of it that never fully emptied. She thought about the Mirathi hunting cat crying over its handler in a corridor on hub station Carrail, and the security team that had not known what it was looking at, and the 12 minutes between the first report and the termination order, and the 11 minutes and 53 seconds in which nothing had happened because no one had known what to do. She thought about what 12 minutes was if you knew what you were doing. 12 minutes was everything. 12 minutes was the difference between a living animal and a dead one. Her ship finished boarding. The gate closed. She looked at Pep. She said, Velton wants to build a xeno-veterinary division inside the course. Pip said, yes, he has already submitted the framework proposal. He submitted it yesterday. He told me to tell you that it was approved this morning pending your agreement to serve as founding director. Sera raised her eyebrows slightly. That was faster than she had expected. Sessions in her experience were not fast movers. Procedurally, they believed in deliberation and consultation and the careful review of precedents. She said. He moved quickly for a session. Pip said, Vika's footage has been viewed 9 million times. The Corps commissioners were not deliberating so much as reacting. She almost smiled. She said, this is not a small thing, Pip. If I say yes to this, it is not a posting. It is building something from nothing. Classification frameworks, approach protocols, cross-species behavioral training for medical staff, how to read pain in a body you do not share, how to move around something that could kill you and have the stillness in you to choose not to be afraid of it. How to teach that? Because you cannot teach it from a book. You can only teach it by putting someone in a room with something alive and hurting and staying with them until they find it in themselves. Pip said, I know. She said, it will take years. He said, I know. She looked at him. She said, you want to be part of? I said, I was there when it started. I watched you walk into that plaza, and I had my scanner and my certifications, and I could not move, and you moved without any of it, and I want to understand how to be the kind of person who moves. She watched his face. He was not performing anything. He was just honest. I do not want to be the medic behind the barrier again. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, you will need more humans. He blinked. She said, I cannot train a division by myself in this kind of knowledge. The animal reading the body language, the patient's specific quality of stillness that you need. It is common on Earth. It is not special there. Every farm vet, every wildlife rehabilitator, every sanctuary worker, every person who grew up working with animals that could hurt them carries some version of this. They have just never been asked to put it in a framework before. They have just never been told that the galaxy needs it. Pip said, can you find them? She looked at him for a long time. She thought about all the people she knew, the colleagues from her training years, the vet who had taught her to smell infection, the woman who ran the big cat sanctuary outside Nairobi who could sit inside a fence with an injured lion and have it eating from her hand in 40 minutes, the man who had spent 11 years rehabilitating Earth's last wild dire wolves and had never once been seriously hurt, not because he was lucky, but because he understood them in a way that went past understanding into something closer to kinship. She thought about what it would mean to call them and say, the galaxy has animals in it that are dying because nobody will touch them, and I need people who will touch them. And I think that is, as she already knew what they would say. She put her bag down. She did not put it down the way someone puts something down temporarily. She put it down the way someone puts something down when the decision has been made and the only thing left is the work. She said, get me a cum channel and a decent coffee. Pip exhaled. She said, and find me Velton. I have questions about those 14 cases. I want to start with the hunting cat. The timeline does not make sense to me yet, and I want to understand what happened before I build a protocol around it, because if I'm going to teach people how to prevent something, I need to know exactly how it went wrong. They walked back out of the docking bay together. Behind them, through the station's wide observation windows, the stars were the same as they always were, cold and enormous and full of distances that made everything Small, but somewhere out in those distances there were ships moving between stations, and in those ships there were sometimes animals, injured, frightened, in pain, unable to ask for help in any language that the galaxy had learned to listen to. And until this morning there had been nobody coming. That was the thing that Sera carried with her as she walked, not the weight of the work ahead, not the scope of it, not the years it would take, or the resistance she would meet, or the framework she would have to build from nothing. She carried the image of the Mirathi hunting cat. 11 minutes and 53 seconds. She was going to make that number irrelevant. She was going to make it so that somewhere out in all those cold, enormous distances, the next animal that was hurting and afraid and alone would not be alone for long, because she knew people, her people, had learned a long time ago on a blue world full of things that could kill them, that the most important skill in the universe was not strength. It was the willingness to reach towards something frightened and stay.